Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 1 of the Oral Talmud. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Vinay Lappy. Hey, Dan.
Hey, Vinay, so good to see you. It's funny because a lot of our old time viewers of this show will know that we've actually been doing a video version of this show for really, I think, on and off for the past 5 years. It started very early on during COVID, and we always meant to release it as a podcast for all kinds of reasons, knowing especially that a podcast would reach a far larger listenership, but it's technically not that easy. So we always kind of got a little bit stymied by that, and we continued doing it. But I'm so excited that now this is going to be a podcast. So, so what? So but I think it's a little bit of an odd form of a podcast because, in a certain sense, a lot of the material that folks who have only listened to it on the podcast are going to hear has been recorded already. Like we know that we're not going to run out of episodes for years, and that's really exciting because my big fear doing the Judaism Unbound podcast was always that we'd like run out of we'd run out of ideas, we'd run out of episodes. We haven't yet, and it's been 9 years, so I'm confident that we won't either. But we know for sure that we have 4 years of material out there, so I'm so excited to share it with people in this new way.
Me too. And what started as something really just for me and you, and, if anyone else found it interesting, great. But if not, that was okay too. Um, I'm really gratified that, um, that some people that find it interesting.
So let me just say a word for folks who are new to the Oral Talmud, which I think is going to be the vast majority of people listening to this. What is it? And hopefully you're here because you were intrigued by the title, or maybe you have heard of one of us, or probably a relative of one of us. But the idea of the Oral Talmud, I want to talk about it in two ways. One is the name. What do we mean by the Oral Talmud? And the second is the format of it. I'll actually start with the format first because I don't know if this is something that we innovated. I like to think that it is. It makes me feel kind of warm and fuzzy, but I think this is something that I've been calling a fishbowl chavruta. So for those who don't know, comes from the root of a friend or partner, somebody that you're connected with. And the idea is that it's a traditional way of studying a Jewish text with a study partner, with a friend. And we're going to talk about that more. But normally, a chavruta is something that happens behind closed doors. I mean, nobody else listens to it. Often you'll break up, you'll study in chavruta for a while and then come back to what's called the shiur, the larger class, and maybe you'll share a little bit out from what you studied in your chavruta. But it's very rare that somebody could like visit somebody else's chavruta. And yet from the beginning, that's what this show has been. It's been a fishbowl chavruta, which I think of as we're studying together. Everybody who's been watching, now listening, is kind of right on the edge and is listening, but it's not a they're not listening because we're so wise and we're teaching them. We're not like that. We're really studying these texts. Sometimes we've seen them before, often not, and we're studying them for ourselves to try to understand them. And the people are there too. We haven't figured out technologically how to include their voices in this, and it might be unwieldy and it might not be a chavruta anymore, and so there would be a loss there. But they're really, really close. They're like over our shoulders, and we are doing it with them. And so, in a sense, like we can't hear them, but they can hear us, and they can be studying along with us. I think there's something potentially powerful there that I don't know. I don't know if there are any other fishbowl chavrutas in history, and certainly not that have been going on for 5 years. And so I think it's something really exciting potentially to invite people into.
And, something you brought out as you were talking just now is, at least for me, is that the chavruta experience, which is generally private, is where not only the magic and the excitement and the experience of flow and all the light bulbs, where all that happens. It's actually the re-embodying, it's the reenactment. It's what the Talmud actually is there to do. It's there to reenact, and I'm a little bit preempting you on what do we mean by oral Talmud, I think, because this is the process of making this text alive, and in that interaction between the two chavrutas, creating something new. I don't know. I think I think we've inadvertently done something quite important, which is shift the spotlight from the fewer, the more public um, space of typical Talmud learning. You imagine the discussion with the teacher in front of the room and all the students looking at the teacher. And as I tell my students, that's not where the real thing happens.
Mm.
That's where you get unstuck a little bit and where you try out what happened with your chavruta. But the real magic is in the chavruta. And I love that we've made that available and accessible to people.
Yeah,
At least I hope we've done that.
yeah, and the title, the Oral Talmud. I mean, there are a number of elements to it. One is that we thought it was going to be a podcast. You know, we always thought of it as a podcast, even though it was video. And why was it video? It had to do with that we were doing it really early on in COVID, and people were all at home, and we had this idea that people were going to be watching video a lot, and so it seemed like doing it as video would be the right thing to do at that time. But we called it the Oral Talmud in part because we always imagined it as a podcast. That's the simple reason. But there are also much deeper reasons. One of which is the idea that, well, there's also the fact that we originally had a different title, which was Talking Talmud, and then we found out after like 2 weeks that there already was a Talmud podcast called Talking Talmud, so we changed it to the Oral Talmud. And the idea of the Oral Talmud was that the Talmud is called the Oral Torah, right? There's this idea that the Torah that we have, the Bible, is just part of a larger body of material that was given by God to the Israelites, right? And there was also the oral Torah, which was all this other stuff that wasn't written down in the Torah, and that, you know, there's all kinds of levels at which you could think about what that means exactly, some of which we've explored on this show, and you'll hear those explorations over time. But one of the ideas of it is that there was this oral material that after, you know, thousands of years got written down, and that became the Talmud. So the Talmud is the oral Torah. And we sort of were imagining what if in the same way there's this much larger body of material that's the oral Talmud, and that hasn't been written down yet, and that we're part of that tradition. I mean, I think that a lot of people say, no, that is the oral Torah, and it is, you know, that the oral Torah continues, right? But it seemed cool to call this the Oral Talmud.
I love the Oral Talmud name. I you've always helped me shift my perspective from learning this thing that is in our past to being a creator of this thing.
Mm.
And I do have a conception of using the Talmud to create something else, but using the Talmud to create a bigger, more effective, more truer Talmud, a manual that is going to do an even better job of doing the thing that has really been lost in the study of Talmud over the last at least several hundred years, has been really exciting to me. And when we learn it, it feels like we really are surfacing a lot of new stuff and stuff that was there and hidden and really needs to be brought up and forward.
Okay, so there's a lot more to talk about in terms of this, in terms of like what this show is about and what we're trying to do here and everything, much of which I think will be revealed over the weeks and months and years ahead. And the reality is, I think part of the podcast format is that it's not for us to say, it's for the listener to say what we're doing, you know, what it's doing for them, if anything, and hopefully it will be something. But in the meantime, you know, some people ask about, well, but who are we? But in the meantime, I think that, you know, people are asking, you know, if it's not our relatives listening to the show, they're asking, who are we? What is this about? You know, who is participating in this fishbowl chavruta? You know, why am I not in the fishbowl chavruta? Why are you guys in it? So let's talk about that a little, B'nai. I mean, I I think that, so maybe let's talk about how we met and who we were when we met, because I remember it really well. Like, I was the Hillel director at the time at the University of Chicago, and we had some funding to have a program where, and we had some funding for an annual program where somebody would come and kind of give an interesting lecture. in memory of a previous Hillel director. And I was new, and I was new to Chicago, and I didn't really know who to invite, and we didn't have that much budget, so it would have to be someone local. And I just sort of asking around, and one of my students said, actually, I had this teacher in high school who was amazing, and she's actually from Chicago, and she's just moved back to Chicago pretty recently, and you should have her. And I didn't really know much about you. I don't think the internet was quite as developed. I mean, it was hard to get information, but she seemed intriguing, and so we invited you, and you had all these. I remember you had all these like demands, like there needed to be a huge whiteboard, and we didn't have a huge whiteboard, and so we had to figure out how to put like big post-its on the wall and everything. And anyway, so then you gave this talk, and it was what's known in the world as your crash talk, and you could say a little bit more about that if you want, but it blew me away. Like I was like, oh my gosh, this is a like theory of these instincts that I've had all along about how Judaism isn't really working for people, but that doesn't mean that Judaism is bad. It can be reimagined. But you had a kind of a whole theory behind it, and that was the first time that I, came to see your work. I think it took a few more years until we really became friends, but that was the beginning of it for me.
Yeah. And I remember that very, very well. Um, I didn't know you were new to Chicago at that time and new to that job. To
Mm.
me, you seemed like the man. You seemed very
The man in a
uh,
good way, or in like the man, like
I kind of in a, well, for me, Hillel was very establishment,
yeah.
and you were the head of that. So you know, you were the establishment, and also an obviously really smart guy. And what I remember most about that lecture was afterward when I got the sense that it really did mean something to you and excite something for you, and that you looked at me as if I had something to say.
Mm,
And given that I had sort of placed you in that realm of the establishment, and um you seemed so obviously, and you are so obviously so much smarter than me, it gave me a lot of confidence to know that that something in what I was bringing was important. That was the sense that you gave me,
mm,
that I had something important to say, and that meant a lot to me.
mm,
And I think that's been an important part of our dynamic, that you are the smartest guy I know. You are, okay, I'll try not to embarrass you, but I just admire you so much. I admire the human being that you are, the mensch that you are. Um, and I have this feeling that you think highly of me. Not forget as a person, I don't know about that, but that you think that maybe I'm smart. I I don't know. I don't want to make this all about my insecurities about my intelligence, but I'm not a scholar, and I have a little bit of self-consciousness about that. Um, but your trust in me and your belief that I have something important to say brings out things in me that I think don't come out when I'm really busy worrying that I'm, not that.
mm.
Anyway.
I mean, I love that you're this insecure because like anybody who does know you and anybody who has been part of the work that you've done over all these years thinks that you're the man, but not in the bad way. Like the kind of like, the person, right? That you're a giant. And I love that you don't see yourself that way because that's the spirit of this show is the idea that anybody can really have a voice. And I mean, I think you're a giant, but if you don't think you're a giant, then that means that you think that anybody can have a voice, right? Because if you can have a voice, then anybody can, right? And I that just gets
I,
to the spirit of what we're doing very deeply.
I love that. I feel like I'm a grasshopper, but in your eyes, I'm a giant, and that's a really nice. It's a nice dynamic, I think.
Mm.
Um,
The I, I well, I mean, there are a few things that I feel have like revolutionized my life in general and my Jewish life in particular. I mean, I've talked a lot of times about reading the book Who Wrote the Bible as something that really gave me something to hang on to in terms of remaining connected to the Bible and remaining connected to Judaism at a time in my life where I felt very alienated by it and this idea that I hadn't been exposed to before that human beings wrote the Bible, and we actually have archaeological and literary evidence of who they might have been, and that there was all this history. That gave me, when I was 17, that gave me something really important to hang on to. And I remember when I was in high school, the rabbi of the high school, I went to a religious high school in Israel, and I remember when we were graduating, everybody had to sit down with the rabbi of the high school, and he asked like what you were going to be doing in the future, and I told him I was going to college in America, and he said, "Well, I hope that you're going to find somebody there to be your chavruta who wants to study Talmud as much as you do." And at the time, I thought it was like I laughed. It was a joke to me because I didn't want to study Talmud at all. I never wanted to see it again. And I said to him, "Well, I don't think that will be a problem." By which I meant I'm not going to be studying any Talmud. And the joke is on me because I found that chavruta. It took a while, and not only that, but it wasn't only that it wasn't that I wanted to study Talmud and found a chavruta. It was that I found a chavruta who made me want to study Talmud, and that's you. And I am incredibly grateful to you for that. And you're a giant in my eyes because Richard Elliott Friedman, who wrote the Bible, is a giant because he gave me the Torah and you gave me the Talmud. So I just feel incredibly grateful for this. And it's like of all the things that I think of that like bring me joy, in my work life, let's say, how would I want to spend my time in my work life? Like I can't really imagine something more fun than just spending all day studying Talmud with you.
I so feel the same way. Um, I think we're so lucky that there's something about our approach to the tradition and to life and the world that's really fundamentally very similar.
Hmm.
I think because of my insecurities, but because of you, something else in you, which is not about insecurity. We're both pretty open and excited about learning and questioning and really holding our truths lightly and really trust each other and really feel loved by each other. And I think that's a big part of what makes our chavruta work.
Yeah, it's interesting because it goes back to like when we met. So, I said we didn't become friends till a few years later. And part of that was because I remember being so like blown away by your talk. And then I remember going out to the parking lot with you, like walk you to your car. And somehow we were talking about stuff and you just seemed like really religious to me. And like in a way that I have always kind of rebelled against and not felt drawn to. I don't remember what it was, but like, you didn't drive on Shabbat or whatever it was. And I was like, wow, you're so open, like this theory of how Judaism changes is so amazing, and yet you're still doing it kind of the old way in a lot of ways. That was my impression. I don't know if that was true at the time or not, or you changed, but at the time, that was kind of my perception. I was like, oh, this was awesome. I really like this person. I like this perspective, but we're very different. And of course we're very different in other ways. I mean that you were very much, building this queer yeshiva and I was straight, and so like what was that going to be? And so it just felt like, wow, this is a great experience, a great moment. And then I remember a few years later we actually had some more funding for a different program that not just was a lecture, but now it was a weekend, and we had like 6 weekends in a year, something like that. And we invited all kinds of people, and we were like brainstorming for who to invite. And one of my staff members said, "Oh, B'nai Lappy, she's really great, and she's around." And I was like, "Oh yeah, B'nai Lappy, I remember her. She was really great a few years ago, and yeah, we should have her again." And the students have graduated; it's different students, and I think you came back. You probably did the crash talk again. In those days, that's what you. I mean, still no, but that's what you did a lot in public performances, and I was blown away again. But somehow that time we really connected, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but I think that it was this kind of openness, this idea that, we have our commitments, and yet I think that one thing that I feel very strongly about me, and I think about you, and is that I'm not afraid to hear other ideas. Like, I don't understand why you should be afraid to hear other ideas. Generally, when I hear an idea that is in conflict with mine, I actually find my mind immediately is trying to problem solve and figure out the way that it's not a conflict, which, by the way, is often a Talmudic thing that the Talmud does, is tries to say how these cases that seem contradictory aren't really contradictory. And so I think that there was just something in that orientation, and I remember that we decided at that time that we should get together regularly, and I think that it was like there was this thing that I probably thought like maybe once a month or something, and I think you said like, oh, I'm going to come every week to spend a few hours with you in your office, and you lived an hour away, and I was like, wow, this person really must like me, So it was kind of like it was definitely one of those ones where it's nice to be appreciated in both directions.
I, as you're talking about being wrong and changing our mind, and um, it occurs to me that maybe one of the reasons why it's sometimes hard to hold our truths lightly is that we're afraid that if we're wrong, if we got it wrong, people won't love us anymore. The person who sees that we got it wrong will lose respect for us or will lose their trust in us and won't like us anymore, because maybe the thing they liked about us was our idea or I don't know what. Um, but with us, I don't have any question that you are going to still love me no matter what I get wrong. And I used to say in Svara in the yeshiva that our origin story and the methodology and the culture came about because I only taught the people that I loved.
Mm,
And I only gathered people who I could love. And I used to always say to our teacher trainees, only teach people you can love because you're only going to be your best self with those people. But it has only become clear to me that it's really not who I can love. It's who I can feel confident is going to love me back,
mm,
even when I get it wrong, even when I mess up,
mm.
even when I disappoint them. And I think that's a big part of what I have with you, that you're going to still love me.
Well, it's really also helpful in thinking about our pedagogy in this show, as right, because I think in general for a teacher, I mean, we've both been teachers. I was a law professor for a while. I mean, we've had teaching experiences where, like, we don't. It's not that we don't love this. We don't know the students so well. It's a huge lecture class or whatever it might be, and how do you how do you how do you teach with love in that way? And actually, this idea of the fishbowl chavruta may be a solution to that, because I can love you and you can love me and we can learn together. And if the person is like sitting on our shoulder, learning along with us, like in a way, they're part of that loving learning, that in a way that would be almost impossible to create any other way. So I'm kind of
Mhm.
fascinated by that as a pedagogy.
Yeah. I hope that comes through. And I can't imagine that it doesn't. I can't imagine that. Um, anyway, for me it fills our time together. So I hope people experience that and go, "Oh, that's the thing I'm looking for." As my colleague Lenny Solomon always says, we're not teaching people how to be liberatory human beings or create other liberatory spaces or worlds. We are hopefully giving them an experience of liberation, an experience of being loved and being very able to hold their truths lightly. And that in of itself, I think changes you. So,
Yeah. Well, we I don't think we were conscious of this, and I don't think that we've ever been conscious of it. I'm curious about your thoughts on this, but right, the great Chavruta story in the Talmud is the story of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, which we spend multiple episodes on later in this series. Um, and the famously, I mean that's also there's a queer level to that story, meaning that their love might have been beyond the love of learning, right? And we get deep into that, but one of the elements of it is that sort of at the end of the story, it kind of ends badly for all kinds of reasons, and Reish Lakish eventually dies, and Rohan is devastated, and they bring him this other chavruta to study with, who basically is always telling him that he's right, and he's like, "Get this person away from me! I don't want somebody to tell me that I'm right." When I would have a chavruta with Rabbi Yochanan, I mean, when I would have a chavruta with Reish Lakish, he would tell me how I'm wrong, and I don't want a yes man. I want that kind of tension, and not that we that
Yeah, and he says it by him doing that, my Torah got sharper.
and
Yeah.
not that we have like a lot of tension and profound disagreement between us, and so but but it's interesting because I almost feel like there are elements where like the fact of our chavruta is that in the sense that like I remember when we first started learning together, it wasn't you and me together. It was that I had invited you to lead some Talmud learning for my staff. This was I had kind of gone through it. Like I had actually had like a bad breakup with the Jewish Federation of Chicago with Hillel, and we were doing this like alternative Hillel kind of organization. And you had helped me through that in all kinds of ways. And I wanted to kind of profoundly build Jewish learning into the new organization that I was creating. And and so your approach had really inspired me, and I wanted you to learn with us, and you insisted on learning in this very particular way where that involves like studying in the original Aramaic, even though none of my staff knew any Aramaic or Hebrew, and memorizing and all these things. And I was like, B'nai, like I don't think these things are important. Like let's study a lot of Talmud stories, and let's just kind of give them a depth, but also a breadth of different ideas that they could study. And you said no, we have to do it this way, and I kind of said okay, I'm willing to go along with this as an experiment. And we studied this one particular text, and we probably spent, I don't know, months and months and months with a weekly study of this text, and finally got through it. It was like two sides of a page. And you told me I can't look up the translation at all, and I didn't. And then when it was over, and it was an amazing experience, and everybody loved it, and everybody got so much out of it. And when it was all over, I read the original English. Sorry. And when it was all over, I read the English translation, and I was astonished because I realized that most of the amazing conversations that we had would not have been able to be had if we had studied it in English, because the English translation kind of resolves a lot of the ambiguities that are in the original. And that was very eye-opening to me in terms of the tension was that you had a different approach to studying Talmud than I did, and you were right. But also, I had a different approach that this show kind of allowed to give a try, which is that you had convinced me that kind of lingering and really at least checking the Aramaic to see what other readings are possible is so important. And yet I also had a sense that there was something to covering more material more quickly, or that there was something in the English that would be worthwhile. And I, when we started thinking about doing a podcast together, I thought like, I don't see how we could possibly do it in Aramaic and, have an audience. And you kind of said, okay, I'll give that a try when COVID happened, because it was like, we got to do something. And I think that this show has actually ended up being a style of Talmud study that is new, that is in English, but it's sort of inflected with your
Yes.
approach.
Yeah. When we started learning, I was very reluctant and I was very orthodox about only learning in the original. I never, ever teach in translation. I refuse any invitation that asks me to teach, a 1 hour slot and I'm going to no, get somebody else. I'm not your guy for that. I don't do a good job of that. And when you wanted to learn in English, I was like, I don't know. I don't know. I don't see this being anything. But I think we've discovered something. I think we've discovered some kind of middle ground where maybe partly because you saw some value in what can happen in the opacity of the original. And I came to see that maybe because of who you are, that depth can come out even learning in translation. I don't know, but we should think about this more. We've never talked about this, but I think we're avoiding the problem of learning in translation, which is, as you were saying, is typically about it putting you as the learner in a very passive
Mm.
place, because it also seems very finished and clear. Um, and yes, one of the problems is it lands in its clarity on one of many possible options, but also because it isn't very stimulating. It doesn't, when you have a puzzle and not all the pieces are there, it draws you in to try to figure something out. And one of the things the Talmud, I think, is deliberately structured to do is to stimulate you to think and talk and interact in that very creative, figure it out kind of way. And I think we've found some kind of sweet spot where we create a very inside, thick, not too cleaned up translation in English. And we go very slowly. And I'm always looking at the original. So we're doing a little bit of a dance there. I don't know.
Yeah. No, and I mean, I think listeners should understand that we have done a fair amount of working with the translation. We're not just pulling a translation off the shelf. We are
Yeah.
generally using the translation that's available on Safaria, which is the translation. It's actually a translation of a translation because Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz wrote a Hebrew version of the Talmud where he basically translates from Aramaic into Hebrew, and then the English version translates from his Hebrew into English, and that's the edition that's available on Safaria. But we take that translation and we'll change it to try to preserve ambiguity if that's what we're trying to explore and to do other things. We're not always perfect at that, but we do some we but we are making an effort to create a translation that is not just smoothing things out, that actually is one that we can have that style of learning with.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, and and I think that that may also be part of the innovation of this show.
I think another thing that makes our learning work, even though we're learning in English, is that we are on the same page in terms of our assumption. Our main assumption is the surface meaning is not primarily what this text is here to tell you. Whatever the surface content is, which a nice translation uh, makes it hard to avoid landing on. Do you know what I mean? A nice translation makes the surface content very prominent because your brain immediately understands it and is in that surface. But we begin learning a text with the assumption that there's something underneath there. This text is trying to do something other than what the so I think that's an important piece of why we're able to do what the Talmud is, I think, trying to stimulate us to do, in spite of the fact that it's in English.
Yeah, and that goes to the question I think of yeah, and that goes to the question I think of what we're trying to do on this show beyond modeling Talmud study or more than modeling, inviting you into a certain kind of Talmud study. Like, so what kind of Talmud study is it? Because there are different kinds of Talmud study, and we're doing, I think, a particular set of kinds, and that has evolved over the course of the show. So, just to give folks a little bit of a taste of what's to come, in the early days of the show, and partly this was also because of COVID and because like there were opportunities and there was time in a way that there's less now. We had this thought that basically every other one, or I forget what our original thought was, we were going to have us studying a text, and our thought was that we would study a complete story in one show. We would do it, and sometimes two, and we would have guests who were prominent people that we admired, that were involved in one way or another with the Talmud and that had interesting things to teach us. And over the course of time, we started to have guests less often. And we also started to linger on certain texts for much longer than one episode. And then sometimes we because of getting so much out of those lingerings, we would go back to a text that we had already studied and study it again. And so there are ways that we could have when we release these shows, we could have sort of brought those together. I think we're going to end up releasing the podcast the way that we did it on video. Um, but so sometimes there was a text that we studied twice or three times over the course of years, right? And sometimes there was a text that we studied, for 10 weeks in a row, right? And I guess that raises this question for me of like, especially, well, maybe thinking, well, and that raises the question for me, both looking back at what we were thinking when we started, what you're going to hear over the next few weeks and months, and what we started to do over time. Did we start to study Talmud differently? Like, do you have a sense of what we're trying to do? Like, when do we know that we've gone deep enough, or when do we know that we've exhausted a particular topic? And I think that in those early days, we were just like, well, we had to do it in an hour. And so we would kind of keep things moving. And over time, I think we came up, over time, I think a different sensibility. I'm curious, like, how you think about that.
Yeah, well, I remember when we started, we dug out that old list that you and I created together of what we called the greatest hits of the Talmud, which we had put together as a kind of leadership for some other project we were working on years ago. Remember that?
Yep.
And those, for me, were the greatest hit texts because they were examples of the rabbis being innovators, even to the point of overturning Torah, which which to me was a mind-blowing realization when I began learning Talmud, that the tradition isn't fixed and unchanging the way we're taught it is. And those things that are distasteful in the tradition actually can be changed.
Mm.
And we don't have to either stay and suck it up or leave. And that, for me, that was at least phase one of the project. It was to, let those who have left, essentially, and those who are in danger of leaving know that there's a third option.
Mm.
That they can stay and make it better, and they stand on the shoulders of very brave people just like them who did that very thing. Okay, so I think the first thing we were doing was learning those greatest hits. And those were texts that I had learned many times and taught many times. And I had a really fully formed chap on. Like I had a take
Hmm.
on all those texts. And I remember in the early days, I was kind of driving. You would turn to me at the beginning of our show and I would do the framing and I knew where we were going to go. And it was always fun and different, but basically I was trying to get this certain message. It was really clear to me across. And then we ran out of those texts.
Mm.
And my understanding of what happened next was we just, well, partly you would bring text that you had stumbled on in Daf Yomi, right?
Being the practice of studying one page of Talmud every day, which I've been doing for the last 5 years or so with my wife.
Right.
My other friend.
Or we'd be interested in a certain topic like conversion or uh whatever it might have been, the ordination of rabbis or leadership. And then we would look for what texts might be dealing with that somehow, which neither of us knew, or if you knew it better, you would drive. But I think our learning has become much more open and actually much more exciting to me as we started learning texts that neither of us knew. Um, we were really both open to wherever it was going to take us. And I've been sort of astonished at our ability to get underneath a text in English that neither of us knew. And I feel like I have trained myself to find things in text, but you have that as well. You have this intuitive ability to see what may be going on under the surface. And I feel like together we're like the Tacoma Narrows Bridge.
That's
You
not
know
the one
what?
that fell down, is it?
It is the one that fell down.
Wait,
But
why that?
because the important part is not that it fell down. The important part is what caused it to explode. And let's see, I don't know if I'm going to get my science right, but it has something to do with the coefficient of friction or whatever of the material with the frequency of the wind. And when those frequencies met, you know,
Something explosive happened.
yeah, that
Yeah.
exactly.
It's funny. I remember, I mean, I was joking, but in those early days, I remember that people, when we would skip a week, I would get an email that said, when will Rabbi Lappy's class happen? And I was like, what am I, Jeff Liver? This is not Rabbi Lappy's class. This is our Chavruta, so, but maybe over time I contributed more. But the, um, I, I was thinking though that maybe we could talk a little bit about queerness because I think that we should talk about what our take is on the Talmud because it's not just two people studying Talmud. And it's not just two people studying Talmud who fundamentally are seeing what the rabbis were doing as radical, right? I mean, our basic idea is that the rabbis were reinventing Judaism and they weren't just interpreting it as is often framed in terms of what the Talmud's doing, right? The Talmud's often framed as the Mishnah as an interpretation or a commentary on the Torah, and the Gemara, which is the main part of the Talmud, is a commentary on the Mishnah, and it's this unbroken chain of commentating and nothing new, don't nothing to see here, just keep moving along. It's an unbroken chain of tradition, and we're reading it with a take that says no, what the Mishnah is a radical rewriting of Judaism, and what the Gemara is a radical rewriting of that Judaism that includes an attempt to try to tie the two together, the old Judaism and the new Judaism, but it's still radical in its own way, and it's revealing that. And we had wonderful guests on early in the show who are going to talk about, academic scholars who talk about the theory of that. But I think that the queerness element of it is that I think that for us, these are not scholarly notions only. There's a existential element to this, and in the sense that our own life experiences require us to be able to read the Talmud and Judaism this way, or be out, right? And I in terms of like sexual orientation, I am, I feel I'm straight. I mean, what are you going to say? And yet you have always insisted that there are different forms of queerness, and that there are ways that people who are straight in terms of sexual orientation can also be considered queer. Not all such people, but that a certain life experience makes you queer in a certain way. And I would love if you could talk both about like how your read on Talmud is inflected through queerness of the way that we generally understand it as sexual orientation, and then also that other potential form of queerness.
Yeah, my understanding of queerness is not, doesn't actually require, let me say it differently. My understanding of queerness doesn't primarily have to do with sexual orientation or gender.
Mm,
For me, queerness is about a perspective that one gains from the positionality of being on the margin, which is a very precious location from which to have a valuable perspective on what's really going on in the center and what's really wrong with what's going on in the center. And and taking that insight that you gain from being the outsider, from being the one who's marginalized, and walking that through the world to make that center or a new center a better world and a better place. And people have embodied queerness for a variety of reasons. And one of the reasons why I started to use the term queer from the get-go in framing of Svara the Yeshiva rather than LGBTQ is that a whole lot of gay people aren't queer and a whole lot of heterosexual people are queer. If and there I recognize that we queer folk, the folks who had the perspective from the margins, had something fundamentally in common with the rabbis.
mm,
I see the early rabbis, the shapers of what we now have as Judaism, and the system of um, a constantly changing, evolving tradition and a mechanism, a spiritual technology for making us, and that's Talmud study, the kind of human beings who can tolerate change, upheaval, uncertainty, holding our truths lightly and so on. Their marginality was central to what they created.
Mm,
I saw them as queer,
mm,
not in a sexual orientation sense, a gender sense, but from that marginality, um, from the power structure that had, fortunately for them, just crashed. But they were cooking up this tradition even when that power structure was in force, and what I call the crumble before the crash. And and once I saw myself in them, I made the assumption, and I don't think it was even conscious until very recently, that their system was meant to be handed down to me. That they meant for us to do what they did. I was just talking to my colleague Mo Gomery, who Mo and Lainey and I were real partners in shaping Svara, and she said something that came out of a chevruta with Lainey about really the central issue not being the question, is the tradition radical or not? Did the rabbis create this radical tradition? But did they mean for us to carry it on or not?
mm.
Did they mean for them to be able to do really radical things, or did they mean for us to do them as well? And I just always assumed that they did. I always assumed the Talmud was this love letter to all of us, that it was the instruction manual that was meant to be handed down. And I still think that's the case, um, mostly because it was created hundreds of years after the voices in it, the rabbis in it, lived. And so, as a highly curated document, it had to be meant to do something. And that's what I think it was meant to do. It was meant to be used by those people on the margins, the queer folk in every generation, because those are the ones who have the most at stake personally, and are, they've survived because they've basically said, I I think what my inner voice is saying is right, and I trust myself. And that kind of experience gives one a lot of courage. And I'm interested in queer folk of whatever variety of queerness, whether it's because of being non-white in a white world, in a white, you know, whether it's because of race or disability status or gender or sexual orientation or you name it. Um, because I think those folks are most able to take what's in the Talmud and do something with it, most able to actually carry on um, this radical process of re-envisioning and re-asking, how can we make this better? How can we make this system better to make better people who make a better world?
Yeah, and it's interesting to be none of those things, right? In other words, to be straight, to be white, to be not disabled, etc. Uh, and say, but that perspective speaks to me, and I want to be part of it. And I feel like it has given me the capacity to have a voice as well. And I understand that some people aren't interested necessarily in my having a voice there. I don't think that that's I think that that's not inevitable, and I don't think that that's helpful. I think that it's good for us to say, hey, there aren't that many of us who are both alienated from the tradition and who love it, or who have the potential to love it, and let's get together and see what we can make of it. um, I feel incredibly grateful to live in a time where queer Torah is available, and I feel even more grateful to be invited by you to be part of it, because you could have said, this isn't for you, Dan. This isn't, and you never said that because you don't believe it. But but you never said that. And it it it's one of those things. It's almost like a double donkey story. So you have this idea of the donkey stories, which comes from someone else, but the idea was that if donkeys, literal donkeys, could read the Torah, they would notice all these stories in the Torah that involve donkeys. We notice those too, but we often just think, well, somebody rode in on a donkey. It's about the person who rode in on the donkey, but it's not about the donkey. And the donkeys would say, oh, it's about a donkey, and there was a guy on him, right? And let me try to understand deeply what that donkey must have been thinking, or what was really going on, and why a story would have been written about a donkey. And right, and so you have this layer of meaning that nobody else sees, literally nobody else sees. And there's a level at which, right, the first level of thinking about what does it look like when queer folk read the tradition is they notice all the queer folk in the stories, meaning often sexual orientation or gender queer, but maybe other forms of queerness as well, marginality, certainly people of color and disability and people with disabilities, but also other kinds of marginality. You could imagine that they're reading those, that there's stories about them. And then there's another level where you say, wait a second, if there's stories about them, maybe the writers were them, right? Or understood them. If they were good stories, then maybe the writers had some reason to understand and to empathize with those characters. So maybe they themselves were queer, right? And then there's a whole capacity to say, well, if they were doing, so maybe it's not two levels, it's like four levels. If the writers were queer, weren't they probably trying to do a queer thing like we're doing today? So let's not assume that they were just carrying on the chain of tradition. If it looks like they were doing what we would have wanted to do, then maybe they were actually doing it. And then the next level is if they were doing it, we could do it. And then the last level, the one that like works for me, is like if I look at that, I sort of see a different kind of donkey story in that, because I see the people that were marginalized, that would have been thought to be part of the majority,
Yes, yes, yes.
that were part of the queer parts. In other words, some of the rabbis were straight, right? But were doing things in a profoundly queer way. And it's only because the sexual orientation and other forms of uh, more generally thought of as queer folk have have unlocked that for themselves, that it also unlocks something for me for which I feel like profound gratitude and want to pay that forward, to other, right. And the last thing I'll say about that is like a story that we study, this story about when Rabban Gamliel was thrown out of his position, and Elazar ben Azariah came and replaced him. And the story is that Rabban Gamliel had these rules and regulations that kept a lot of people out of the study hall. And when they took away the rules and regulations, all these people flooded into the study hall. And the part of the story that moves me the most is that the first thing that those people do is they decide that a different person who the Torah says can never be a Jew can be a Jew. And meaning that the first thing that people do when the doors are open is they open the doors even wider. And that, I feel, is the ethos of this show, that we don't believe that the doors should be open wider and then closed. There's this notion that the doors should be open even wider and then wider and wider and wider. And that is a loving spirit of invitation that I think really sits at the core of what we're trying to do.
Yeah. And I think you're getting at one of the reasons that I love learning with you so much. And that is because you see donkey stories that I don't see. And, because of my life experience and all the scars and the trauma, and that have been left for me that I carry. Sometimes my focus is on one part of a story or one message in a story, and I can't see what else is going on, and I can't see more nuance or the postscript. And you see a lot of that I don't see, and it's so exciting for me.
So, Benay, even though this was our introduction to the podcast version of this conversation, it just felt weird to me to imagine doing an episode of the Oral Talmud without actually studying any Talmud. But knowing that we would only have limited time for this, we chose a very short text, and one that is connected to the topic that we've been discussing, which is Chavruta study, studying with a partner. So, so I want to look at that text and have a little bit of of learning of it with you, and then we can sort of wrap things up for today's episode and invite people to go on to everything that we have for them coming forward. So this is a famous text that comes from a collection of sayings called Pirkei Avot, the sayings of the ancestors, or the people sometimes call it the ethics of the fathers, or the sayings of the fathers. It's sort of a prequel to the Talmud. It's I think of it as this
It's a prequel to the prequel.
a prequel to the prequel. Like I think of it as this kind of like you're supposed to. It's like you're supposed to read this before you start reading the Talmud, and there's all these sayings and ideas, and it's also about the chain of transmission of the Torah. There's a lot in there, and but we're just picking out one of the sayings because it relates to this idea of chavruta. So this
But
is
but I don't think we should disregard the context of this text.
okay.
And it feels very important. It feels like its location in the first piece of oral Torah that's created after the destruction, and almost immediately after the grand myth is put down that this oral Torah was also from God and it's divine, and it was passed down along with the written Torah from God to Moses and handed down to all of us. This is our new origin story and the new legitimating story of what is going to be for the next many hundreds of years of very in progress, thin, I don't know how this is going to turn out. Is it going to even be Judaism? Is it going to feel Jewish kind of system? And it feels like this text in this position is not, it's not just saying a nicey nice thing. It's laying down a methodology. It's saying, this is how this is going to be a really important practice or way that we're going to create this new world. Okay, so I think that's really the context of where this line drops.
Hmm. Well, that's making me think that, 5 years from now, for our new listeners, we should start studying Pirkei Avot as part of the Oral Talmud. The basic idea, right, is that the Pirkei Avot starts and says that the Torah was handed down from God to Moses to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and eventually like makes it into the hands of the rabbis. And then it kind of goes from rabbi to rabbi, and they basically give each rabbi in the chain, meaning chronologically in the chain, each generation of rabbis kind of has one or two representatives, and each of them is given essentially one line of this was their great saying that they used to say, right? And so this one is a very early one, because this is from chapter 1 of Pirkei Avot, verse 6. So the person who's being mentioned here, Yehoshua ben Parachia, is one of the very earliest in the kind of proto-rabbinic chain of transmission, and he says, and so Pirkei Avot says, Joshua ben Parachia, Yoshua ben Parachia says, make for you a teacher and acquire for you a friend. In Hebrew, that's and be judging of all people with the scale weighted in their favor. In Hebrew, veheve. Oh, let me say that again. And in Hebrew, that's veheve. And so we tried to do one of these translations that is not fully smoothed out so that we can do a little bit of talking about it. We tried to get pretty close to the original Hebrew and what it uh, sounds like. And just to make one thing clear, that in the Hebrew, we have the part that says acquire for you a friend, uknei ver and chavruta are the same word essentially. One is in Aramaic and one is in Hebrew. Uh, and it's not clear that this is referring to chavruta as we think of it, a study partner, but it's not clear that it's not, and it very well may be. So
Yeah, I think the common translation of friend completely misses what this, I was about to say piece of advice is getting at. And again, not to beat a dead horse, but to take a kind of Rashi framework on this. Anytime you read Rashi's commentary, 11th century great commentator on the Torah and the Talmud, you can really only understand what he's saying if you understand the question that what he's saying is an answer to. So I really think we don't have to figure it out right now, but we have to hold in one hand as we're listening to the answer. What's the question that this is the answer to? I do not accept that these are, oh, this guy used to always say it. He used to drive us all crazy with this. He was famous for that. It's not that. It's, I don't know, we could surmise right now what we think the question is. But let's answer, find the answer, and then let's ask the question, what is this answering? What what's the question that this is the answer to? Okay. So the first thing that jumps out at me is the very weird language, make for you or make for yourself a teacher. That's weird.
Hmm.
That's weird. And, you know, they could have said, find a teacher. Well, you would never say
Right.
make a teacher. What does that mean? Make a teacher. Get a teacher. Find a teacher. But the fact that they didn't say that makes me think they're saying something different than locate one. Making so what does it mean to make someone your teacher? Is a question that this section is prompting for me. And and that bothered a lot of commentators because I know some of the classical commentaries on this. It's bothered, you know, readers of this text for a long, long time.
Mm.
And, you know, one of the classical answers to make for yourself a teacher, I think it's Bartanura, what classical commentary in the Mishnah, who says, e even if this person doesn't know all that much, don't don't take that fact that they don't know very much as saying they shouldn't be your teacher. Make them your teacher anyway. I don't know. I find that kind of interesting. But in any case, what do you get? What do you get from the making word?
Yeah, I mean, what it says to me is that the teacher is not, it's like, it's almost like Schrodinger's cat, you know, the question of whether the cat is alive
Uh-huh.
or dead in this box that you hold, you know, that in some ways it's, uh, well, I mean, there's a Jewish version of that, right? Where somebody comes to a rabbi and says, you know, Rabbi, I have a bird in my hand. Is it alive or dead? And the rabbi says, the fate of the bird is in your hand, or something like that, right? That, in other words, that it's you who is going to make someone the teacher,
Uh-huh.
not a teacher. It's not a teacher exists out in the world. Nobody's
Mm,
a teacher unless you make them one.
I love that. I love that. And you're not going to be able to learn unless you get to that place where you're open to this person and believe they have something to teach you.
Yeah, and so like you can imagine a person who's like an authorized teacher, and you can imagine a person who's not authorized, who's just a wise person or somebody that you admire or somebody that you don't admire. I don't know. I'm not that you don't admire them, but that it's not about admiration. It's about that they're your chavruta. I mean, like a lot of times, like right traditionally, it's you're not your chavruta isn't a teacher. Your chavruta is like another kid in the class, right, or another person, right? And but you're learning, you end up learning from them, right?
You know what you just made me think of? This text comes historically at a moment before there's a new even before there's the new canon to teach. They're coming up with it.
Yep.
So so Rav, the teacher, isn't the person who sort of has mastered or has acquired a whole bunch of stuff that you don't have. Nobody has it.
Right.
And so I think there's something, I think there's a relationship between this first part of the teaching, make for yourself a teacher, and the second part, and acquire for yourself a chavruta. That they're intertwined in some way. And what are you thinking?
Yeah, exactly. Look, no, I think that first of all, there's a couple of different ways that one could read this almost structurally, right? One is that they're just two different ideas: make yourself a teacher and find yourself a friend, right?
Right? Do these
Get
two
yourself,
different things with
yeah,
two different people.
yeah. There's another way to read it that says make yourself a teacher and you will find a friend, meaning like that teacher will become your friend, right? And
Mhm.
I think that there's another way to read it that says um, make yourself a teacher, find yourself a friend, almost like they're both in the same time, meaning find a friend who will be your teacher,
Yeah,
right?
that's what I'm getting now too, which I never saw before, and I love it. And thinking about us, that feels right.
Totally.
The true chavruta relationship is one in which you're my teacher and I'm your teacher.
Right. And I guess like what I would want to say to others who are listening in is that like yes, you and I know a lot of Talmud and knew a lot of Talmud before we started this show. But I think that what you'll find in our learning together is that the real good stuff isn't coming out of things that we know. It's coming out of openness and love that allows us to dig out things that we're noticing. And maybe we notice a little more because we have the Hebrew and the Aramaic, or maybe we notice a little more because we have more context. But if two other people studied it who didn't know that much, they would actually be able to draw a lot out of it, and actually would be better than if they went to some Talmud lecture, which would say the same exact things that they're going to discover on their own, because that and more, right? Because they're going to forget that, but they're not going to forget the things that they dug out on their own with their study partner. And so there's something more powerful, like as a teacher, like you will learn more studying with a partner than you will hearing, sitting at the feet of the great person. And there's something about that your chavruta or your chaver, your friend actually is your greatest teacher, but not because they're qualified. It's because you made them that by having that relationship with them.
Right. And the teacheriness that's happening isn't the transmission of stuff. Um, at Svara, we say that a teacher is someone who makes their learning visible in front of the room, who is learning authentically with the students, but is standing in the front of the room. And you and I have talked about, I remember you telling me the story of one of your law students
Mm.
who who commented that your gift. I'll let you tell this story, but
Well, it's like faded into the mists of misremembering, right? But they say I took it to be like, I'm not sure that you're the greatest teacher, meaning like that my pedagogy was so well developed. But he said you're the greatest student that I've ever seen. Like that your sort of curiosity flows, is obvious, and that my take was that, and they were learning from that, right? That
yeah,
they
yeah.
were learning.
And that's what I meant by we're each other's teacher, that we facilitate learning in with each other because we're making our learning. I don't know. I've lost the thread. But as far as we admonish our students. I don't know if that's exactly the right word, but we say when we teach them how to learn in Chavruta, we say you are responsible for your Chavruta's learning, and your Chavruta is responsible for your learning. I think that's a better way of getting at what's the teacheriness that's going on. It's I'm invested in you. Anyway,
Yeah. So let's just, in the interest of time, go on to the second part of it,
okay.
and just because we want to wrap it up. But like, well, it's interesting in the same way. Like, are these three random statements? Or are they interconnected? Right. And this third statement
Yeah.
is it's in the present tense, v'haveh, right? So that's why we translate it in a weird way. But it says, and be judging all people with a scale weighted in their favor. So my question is, number one, how do you understand that term, that idea? And then the second question is like, why is it connected to this issue of making a teacher and having a friend?
Yeah. Well, it's also in the command form, right?
Right.
You got to be doing this. And I think you're right that all three of these are simultaneous and intertwined elements of a relationship that is going to be generative and growthful and creative and help us bring about the Torah that we're seeking. I think that's what's going on here. And this last element, um, remember what we were saying about loving each other? It's
Yeah.
like I know you're going to keep loving me.
Yeah.
You're going to still believe in me even when I mess up. And I think that's what this last part is getting at.
Yeah.
You're going to still judge me positively.
Yeah.
You're going to retain your regard for me.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I guess it doesn't make it a very interesting, there's a tension here, but I, right, the idea of, well, first of all, the idea of like judging all people with the scale weighted in their favor, right? I mean, just on an image level, right? That
Yes.
the idea that I have, right? So if you think of the scales of justice, right, and that there are two sides to the scale, and one is, and in that scale, in that sort of classic Jewish thinking on the scale, there's there's like the good deeds and the bad deeds, right? And that they're and when you're, when you die, or you're deciding, God's deciding whether you should go to heaven or somewhere else, or whatever, right? That there's an idea of kind of like measuring how many good you did versus how many bad, and if it was weighted towards good, then you're good, and which is a whole interesting thing in and of itself, which I think we've talked about on certain future episodes. But the idea here of, I think, judging with a scale weighted in their favor is if God or you, right, put a thumb on the scale, on the side of the scale that's weighted towards justice, so that even maybe you didn't, uh, uh, in the thumb on the scale, weighted, with the merit, with the good deeds, right, that you put a little extra thumb on there, so even if their bad deeds outweigh their good deeds, they're still going to get, classified as more good than bad, and that thumb on the scale is kind of an act of love.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's an essential element to any relationship that's going to work.
Mhm.
And not just a personal partner kind of relationship, but it's also an important element in an intellectual, and I hesitate to call this an intellectual relationship because it's so much deeper than that. But
Right.
any relationship that's going to be productive and creative, and I still and this is what where I come back to that question: what's the question to which this is the answer?
Mm.
And for me, I'm still working it out, and this is helping me, but it feels like the question is something like, how are we going to do this thing? Our world is crashing, and what we thought was true is no longer true. And the way we thought we were going to live good lives and have a relationship with God, that's it's just not going to be, either because it can't be that way, we don't believe it can be. How are we going to build a new world? What's going to be the essential thing to do to build a new world? And I think this is at least whose answer? Yeah, Yehoshua. I think this is his answer.
Mm.
This is the way we're going to build that new world,
Mm.
by being in relationship to even just one other human being in this way. And what if we then take that way of being and walk through the world that way with everybody? I mean, I think the crucible, the fishbowl kind of thing for them is, we're going to do that to create a new tradition, to create Torah. But that way of being that creates Torah is going to train us to be that way all the time. I think that's the hope.
Mm. Yeah, and just I think maybe to kind of wrap things up, it's that when COVID happened 5 years ago, really 5 years ago, when
Almost, yeah.
when COVID started, there were two things I think that were happening at the same time. Speaking of things, multiple things happening all at once, right? One was that it felt like the world was crashing down around us, and the other is that we were profoundly alone.
Hmm.
And in those early weeks, we were all, I don't just mean you and me, I mean everybody in the world was basically like flailing around trying to figure out like what am I going to do, both to kind of figure out this world and also to not be alone. And you and I decided to study Talmud together. And we could have just taken an hour to hang out every week. We are friends outside of doing Jewish things together, but there's something, and our producer Joey was mentioning this before we started recording, that there's something about adult friendship that maybe as you become older, or in certain contexts, like the way you do friendship, this is how Joey said it, the way you do friendship is through work, through working together. And this is not like working together like that we're paid to, nobody's paying us to do this work together. I mean, in certain ways we make our salaries, but we like choose to do this together. But it's work in the sense that we're trying to accomplish something together. We're not just hanging out as friends. Not that there's anything wrong with that. And I think that we often think about love and work as separate. And in a sense, I think what we're exploring here is whether love can do good work. And I'm excited to have people along for this ride to see what you think.
Love, love, love.